Thank you all. All right. We're getting towards the end of our agenda here, but I'm really happy to welcome Paul Newnham, who's the Executive Director for the SDG2 Advocacy Hub, probably well known to many of you. He's been doing the rounds at South by Southwest this weekend. So Paul, thank you so much for joining us today.
No problem.
So we've had a full day of conversations talking about the immense complexity of our food system, the immense causes and repercussions, and it can feel like a lot to know where to start to begin to address this. You've been working on food advocacy in different capacities for most of your career. How do you think about creating a movement and tackling what is so complex and requires so many different varied stakeholders to come together? How do you get started? What advice would you have for people in the room that are feeling maybe overwhelmed about how to move the needle forward?
Okay, yeah. No, I think it's on. Okay, thanks, Kate. No, it's great to be here today, and I think these kinds of conversations are just so critical. We've heard from a diversity of voices, and I think one of the big starting points, I think, is sometimes when you're in the space, we make it super complicated. So there's lots of silos, it's very technical. We're always trying to make sure that we're getting the right parts in the right language in the right way, and that we're not going to upset anyone or offend anyone. And, we have to take all the scientific, elements and put all that together. The reality of that is that's really, really important for us. But for people out there, it actually means we've got to change the way we communicate. And I think the panel earlier was talking a little bit about film and storytelling. Storytelling is a great way to do it. We have to connect dots across the silos and think in a more holistic way. And so for me, when I think about that and coming into this space, I spent many years kind of making mistakes where you invest a huge amount of energy into these complex campaigns that you really never get outside the kind of echo chamber. Because what you do is you kind of get all the people around you that you're talking to keep saying, yeah, you're doing really, really well. I love that. Because it's a little bit edgy or it's a little bit outside. But when you actually then talk to people out in the street or people that aren't thinking about this all the time, then often they're not completely on board. And so for me, as we've kind of thought about that, and particularly in the space we're in, we're working across complex areas of nutrition, of agriculture, food security, sustainability, regenerative agriculture. All are amazing, big, deep areas that you can spend a lot of time on. But when it comes down to it, what's the outcomes that we want? And it's good food. It's food that's available for people, that has an equal platform, that tastes good, that people can eat what they prefer. And I think preference is really key to think about. And so, for me, it's sort of like trying to understand, how do we bring food back into the conversation, think about the way people engage food, and then connect the work that we're doing into that storytelling.
So you talk about the echo chamber, and the last two times we saw each other was at COP and UNGA, that typical kind of global development, UN-centered circuit where it often is the same people talking about the same issues with the same people. One of the reasons we brought this event to South by Southwest is recognizing that we do need to break out of some of those bubbles and silos we're in. So what has been your experience so far this weekend? What are the conversations you're hearing? What are some insights or ideas that you aren't hearing discussed in some of the other more traditional circles where we might find our community gathering?
Yeah, look, it's been really interesting to, this is my first time at South by Southwest, and so it's been really interesting just to see how art, music, culture is really connecting. And I think, as we've seen the conversations around the food track, it's interesting just to sort of think, how does that just run along in parallel, or is that actually interfacing? And I just came from an event that we just did at Google, where there was a lot of startups, and they were kind of looking at a whole conversation around tech platforms and AI and chat GPT and all these kinds of things. And then we came in and connected to a campaign that we're running called Beans is How. And we started to talk about beans. And I was standing around, and people are coming up and going, I love beans, I love beans. And my mum used to make beans, and we used to eat them this way, and I've never thought to put them in that. And all of a sudden there was this conversation that was going on around food. And that enables, somebody came up and said, I'm a nutritionist, so you don't have to convince me, I know exactly, but there was this like conversation that was very animated, very excited, and very engaging with people that weren't normally talking about food. And so I think for me, this is part of that challenge. We need to have conversations like this. These are critical forums for us to hear from one another, for us to understand what the issues are and how we connect them. But we also then need to be thinking outside and thinking about how do we break through those barriers. And I think it's great to see Devex here at South by Southwest to be kind of bringing this conversation in here and thinking, how do we bring in, and connect to some of those cultural spaces?
So let's talk about beans. I think Paul's the unofficial bean ambassador, or is that an official title, perhaps?
At the moment, it's Chief Beans Officer.
I like it. Okay.
Campaign.
So, we've been talking a lot about technology, innovation, cultivated meat, a lot that's really great science that's really revolutionizing the way we look at food. But beans been around for millennia.
Yeah, it's fascinating because we sometimes sit there and say they're the future of food, and then we say, but they're also the past. And then you go, oh, how do you describe this? I mean, we have launched a campaign with a coalition of actors that's growing very fast. It was launched at COP. And it's a campaign to double the consumption of beans globally in the next 5 years. And so we started in January, the clock, and we're looking at how do we really position beans. And when we talk beans, we're thinking about peas, lentils, the broader family. But where, people don't in the outside world really understand what pulses are, or they don't really use that language. And so we're talking about beans. It's called Beans is How. I've got the shirt on. But the intent is to bring together people to just start to really talk about the benefits based in science, but really communicating the benefits of beans, and to really address concurrent crises. So we have the crisis around the climate, we have the crisis around health, but we also have a cost crisis, and we need to come up with solutions which also are affordable. And beans, as you said, are an affordable solution that you can plant in the ground and you can then be reaping the benefits from in a little while. I think we need to be investing in alternates and technology, absolutely, because I'm a believer in multiple things. But some of those technologies we will not see come to scale for 4 or 5 years with a lot of investment. I think there's things that we can't wait for 4 or 5 years to actually start seeing the impacts and the changes in our diet, in our climate, and the accessibility and affordability. And so for me, it's about championing something that actually helps us get there really quickly. And beans is something that, is also diverse, tasty, culturally relevant in so many different communities, adds to the soil, and, there's so much to learn about it. But it's not like medicine. It's a simple thing that we can all do.
Well, just in case you're wondering, there are some beans on the menu at our food later.
And there was some at lunch. I did notice that.
So quickly, I want to talk about, you mentioned investment, and there's a huge gap in finance. We look at the humanitarian needs. We have the panel that talk about the dire humanitarian needs. We talk about big systems changes that need incredible investment. Where is that coming from? How do you see approaching financing what we need to do to move the needle in food systems?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So one of the other hats we have is we're part of a coalition called Hungry for Action, and this coalition is really looking at the global food crisis and saying, how do we really respond in a way that looks at saving lives now, but also building resilience and securing the future at the same time. So addressing humanitarian need right now, but also at the same time not doing that at the cost of looking at our sustainable food system. And so when we look at that, often the traditional way is to think about ODA, and I think ODA needs to continue to be invested in and increase across governments. But to get to the level, there's always choices, there's always prioritization going on. And we think that we need to think outside the box a little bit here. So we need to be thinking about how do we create new finance mechanisms and streams that can come in. This means looking at debt reform and looking at how debt is being managed. This means looking at the financial institutions and how they are structured to ensure that money is able to actually go into investment in both the short term and the long term. And so that's kind of connects very much to some of the different movements going on around looking at the financial system. You know, there's also things like repurposing subsidies and all of these kinds of things that come into it. But I think what we have to stop doing is just thinking in a one-dimensional way. And we need to start to think, if the system's not working and we're having to make priority choices which are life or death, or about the future, that's not good enough. And so that means we have to be thinking, how do we put pressure for the reform to happen? We have structures like the World Bank, IMF for a reason. We need to make sure that that money's being available and put to use at the country level to be able to respond to these crises.
Yeah, and of course, that is going to be a big push of the spring meetings, World Bank spring meetings next month that our reporters are very on top of and covering. So if you're interested in that topic, definitely stay tuned to Devex. Well, Paul, thank you so much for your time today, and eat more beans.
Thank you. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks.